Hi there, my name is SlowWolf, and this is a review and lightweight analysis of Moonlighter by Digital Sun Games. Moonlighter is a top-down RPG with roguelite elements that came out in late May of 2018 after a successful Kickstarter campaign. It's a beautiful game, with excellent sprite work and animation, backed by a solid and thematic score. People like Moonlighter, which is no surprise because of how inviting it is. But despite a strong showing early on, I felt that the game was a bit of a test of willpower by the end of it. Moonlighter does many things well, but falters on other points. I'll be talking about the story a bit here, so spoilers ahead. If you're still interested, then let's get started. You can feel when some games have been indie developed. They're organic experiences, unique in how they blend genres and ideas together that might not otherwise be popular or well known. Moonlighter follows that trend. It's beautiful to look at, to listen to, and to watch. It blends a soft, friendly-looking game with roguelite mechanics, which are traditionally harsh and brutal. Classic games in the genre of roguelites, like Rogue Legacy and The Binding of Isaac, are well known for being tough and unforgiving, killing players that play badly in very little time. Newer games that use these mechanics, like Wizard of Legend and Into the Breach, are equally difficult at first. Mastery in a roguelite takes trial and error, as well as an in-depth knowledge of the game's priorities and focuses. Moonlighter puts these mechanics into a familiar frame, a top-down action RPG. The Binding of Isaac and The Legend of Zelda were both stated inspirations for Moonlighter on their Kickstarter page, and it's easy to see the influence in-game. It trends towards the softer look of games like The Minish Cap or A Link Between Worlds, and makes some serious changes to the borrowed roguelite mechanics that soften the blow of a failed run. Moonlighter is, as a result, a kinder and more gentle game with a focus on rewards rather than punishments to teach a player. That's not to say Moonlighter isn't difficult, per se, but it tends to veer away from challenging past the first level. The tutorial ends with a hopeless fight against an infinite number of monsters, which teaches the player that you're going to lose sometimes. That lesson is softened immediately afterwards, though, when your character is tossed out of the dungeon, nursed to good health, and then taught how to tend to the store. Dying might happen, sure, but the game just pats you on the back. No big deal, buddy. Here's a store where you can make money. This loss is the only harsh lesson in the game, really, and Moonlighter's already putting on a bandage and kissing the boo-boo better. Even hard mode, the developer recommended difficulty setting of the game, by the way, they explicitly tell you the hard mode is what we recommend, doesn't really hit all that hard. For the first dungeon, this is fine. Players need a place to learn and experiment with the mechanics of the game and how they all work together to create a very engaging feedback loop of delve, sell, improve that Moonlighter is actually really good at. The game gets stale by the third dungeon though, and Moonlighter's initially vibrant introduction begins to wear thin. Enemies begin to repeat with only slight variations, meaning that the strategies you use to defeat them in the first dungeon still work much later on, and items lose their unique value and fall into one of only a couple categories. Even the levels start to feel samey despite the very detailed and intricate level art doing its best to look as different from other environments as possible. When the entire game is a slightly mechanically tweaked copy-paste of the first level, difficulty stops being a question of skill, but one of endurance. For a dungeon crawler with roguelite elements, what is supposed to be a combination of genres that should elicit an addictive and easily repeatable experience hinged on variety and exploration, instead, it's a bit of a shame that boredom and sameness become a pretty significant problem here. Moonlighter is not the only game to attempt to blend roguelite elements into an exploration-based game. Sundered, developed by Thunder Lotus Games, and Chasm, developed by BitKid Inc., are Metroidvanias that attempt to increase the replayability of the game by randomizing the levels through computer-generated room placement and enemy deployment. The problem with letting a computer do a designer's job is that nothing feels memorable, and exploration becomes tedious. Both Sundered and Chasm suffer from this kind of problem a great deal. Moonlighter does as well, even though there are some genre differences. Moonlighter is engaging, first and foremost. It can be fun, especially if you're into the shopkeeping aspect, and seeing your tiny pile of gold fill into a Scrooge McDuck-sized pool is hugely satisfying, as is upgrading your shop in the nearby town. It's just a shame that fully one half of Moonlighter, and very importantly the more mechanically challenging aspect of the game, is only engaging most of the time, but not necessarily fun. Furthermore, Moonlighter makes a mistake with one of the key aspects of its central action RPG genre: puzzles. Specifically, it has none. Okay, not none, but it has one. It's a room with a switch to open a door. It's not immediately obvious, but it's there, and you have to figure out how to open the door somehow. Every other puzzle, from block pushing to bigger mind benders that you'd normally expect in a Zelda game, or even floor-by-floor puzzles like finding secret rooms in The Binding of Isaac, are absent. Half the brain ticklers in Moonlighter are based on combat scenarios. Which enemies get priority, which threats you can dodge entirely, and which of the two equipped weapons is best for the job. This is a fine way to do things, except I need to remind you that combat gets samey, and the rhythms of combat aren't helped by the floaty sound effects, nor the almost intangible impact your character has on the monsters around him. The other half of the puzzle equation has to do with inventory management. I like the inventory management in Moonlighter. At first, items are simple and are tossed into your bag like so much trash. It only takes a couple of minutes, however, for your first cursed item to appear. Cursed items have a variety of effects, like placement restrictions in your bag or destroying nearby objects in your pack once you leave the dungeon. These effects get crazier and more intricate as you delve further into the dungeons and loot higher quality chests, creating some legitimately interesting pack management. You want to spend time working through all these interactions as well, since organizing your backpack properly can lead to carrying more loot back home than you would be able to normally. Still, it's not a perfect substitute for room puzzles or run-like puzzles like you might find them in other games. Moonlighter's too damn charming to be angry at though, and it's far too kind to be upset with. It encourages risk through reward, rather than punishing the player and expecting them to be happy about it. It's a more laid-back, relaxed approach. The faster you want to complete the game, the harder it'll be, but taking a slower pace is totally okay too. This is unique. A lot of games that incorporate roguelite mechanics tend towards being harsh, purposefully obtuse, and almost entirely reliant on negative experiences to teach a player. Moonlighter shows that this isn't necessary, and instead relies on incentives to encourage players towards learning how to play the game. I wrote another video essay on the channel for a roguelike called Flinthook. Flinthook is a jump-and-shoot 2D extravaganza that I feel suffered from an appearance issue. The characters and design were adorable, friendly, and left the impression of a more casual blast-em-up experience. Instead, players were given a game that gets very difficult very fast, without giving players a more engaging hook than points, and a minor amount of account progress should the player lose a run. The games are punishing is certainly okay. I play games oftentimes for the challenge of them, but only to a point. Flinthook was just within my tolerance, but the same couldn't be said for others who reached a gameplay cliff and just said, "This sucks, I'm out." Will finds a pendant early on that allows him to leave the dungeon at any time for a small amount of his gold. The game forces you to use it by locking the door behind the player with no other way out. Once you have the pendant, and have been forced to know how to use it, it's up to you when you feel like going back to town during a run. Finishing a dungeon run is not mandatory, and not usually expected either. It will take multiple trips to gather the resources necessary to make enough money and buy upgraded gear, which in turn is needed to explore further in the dungeons themselves. It's a feedback loop that relies on the player making the decision of when to teleport back to town effectively with enough loot to make the trip worth it. It's not hard to figure out when it is a good time either, since Moonlighter will feel too hard to play when it's time to end the run. Moonlighter gets even more relaxed when the player learns that dungeon delving during the day, thanks to a rudimentary day-night cycle, makes the dungeon crawl experience just a little bit easier, allowing players to make progress at whatever pace they feel is comfortable. You can explore twice a day and make as much money as you can, or take the half day off to rest, then sell the loot in your shop the following morning. Either way, you're making money, and that is encouraging. It's needed, and it is progress, and you can do this while being as risky as you please. It's extremely accessible, and that's refreshing as far as roguelites are concerned. I harped on the difficulty levels earlier, and the difficulty of the game in general. That's from my point of view. I've played more than my fair share of top-down Zelda games, including Link's Awakening, Link to the Past, Four Swords, Oracles of Seasons and Ages, Link Between Worlds, and several other games that they inspired. Again, The Binding of Isaac comes to mind. Moonlighter's rhythms and demands are things that I've seen and done for thousands of hours over the course of my life. No exaggeration. That Moonlighter's difficulty isn't a challenge for me might say more about my experiences than the demands of the game. With that said, Moonlighter does another thing that helps new players feel like they can actually play this game, where other roguelites tend to be a little harder-assed about it. You can change the difficulty level of the dungeons whilst in town. Too easy? Make it harder. Too hard? Tune the dungeons down a touch. Combined with the leave when you want progress system and the day-night cycle, and a backpack that still allows you to bring at least one row of items with you should you fail your run, Moonlighter would rather spend its time watching your pile of gold grow than seeing the player stop the game out of frustration. It's refreshing when sometimes all you see is a chorus of "get good" from a lot of games using similar mechanics. At some point early on, Will finds journals throughout the dungeons written by a man called Crazy Pete. Pete was a likable, if eccentric person that really wanted to figure out what the dungeons really were. Story-wise, the dungeons suddenly appeared from nowhere outside of town, and people soon found out that they could loot the dungeons, and they seemingly restocked themselves overnight. For the townies of Rhinoka, it was like printing money. That was until too many people started dying and they boarded up the dungeons. Pete was certain there was more to the story, and got himself killed. Not before he left journals on every floor of every dungeon in the game, however. His journals aren't extensive, mostly speculative, and the ending is highly predictable. It's not much of a story, but it's enough to get Will some ambitions, and for an old man called Xenon to get all worried about Will. If you've ever wanted a cranky old man to talk your ear off about something being too dangerous or risky or whatever, that's what Xenon is here to do. If it isn't clear where the priorities of Moonlighter lie, the story is certainly not the focus. Pete alludes to the dungeons being kept in place to secure something behind a final, 5th door. Naturally, you get through all the dungeons and unlock the final door. It has a big lead-up, a long unlocking process, and a massive portal. Upon entering the 5th door, Moonlighter informs you that you have entered Unknown Dungeon 1. It's large and intimidating at first, but it's filled with computers. All this time so far, and you've never had to do so much reading. Till now. Moonlighter decided that the exposition dump was maybe the best way to tell their story, which is something that I feel didn't really work very well. Although I found it interesting to read the terminals and catch up on the lore, having it all in one lump felt rushed and hastily done. This is a common feeling that I got that becomes apparent throughout Moonlighter. The Golem dungeon features many items that are simply lore-based, just for a story. If you look at the journal Will keeps, many of the items detail the cultures that lived in the dungeons before things went wrong. There are progressively less of these kinds of items as you continue past the second dungeon, which tends to correlate with a lack of diverse enemy types and rooms. I don't want to assume, but it really does feel like the game started ambitious, but finished tired. What cements this for me is the end boss. After going through a Golem King, a massive carnivorous plant, a mechanical sand serpent, and a ball of sentient energy, we get a space pirate that turns into a tentacle beast. It's the only 2-part boss fight in the game, and no part of it is as memorable as the first time you walk into the Golem King. The first time you see the Golem King, it's a treat. The room is silent as the camera quickly pans up a huge room to a pile of rocks in the middle. A massive ooze slews its way into the rocks and animates the golem, staring directly at you. The camera pans down, and the music kicks in. Music throughout the levels before were all thematically tied. It's a good way to give every dungeon its own flavor, but when you hear the same melody many times with only slight variations on a theme, a little variety helps. The boss music does just that, and in a way that feels epic and engaging. Boss themes in Moonlighter are creative, interesting takes on the main menu melody themed to each dungeon. It's a lovely way to get a player to wake up again after a long run through a dungeon, and especially the first time this happens, it's excellently done. The main issue with the Space Pirate boss, for me, is that almost all the lead-up comes from a room full of computers right before it, and the setting comes largely out of nowhere. It gets even weirder when you beat him, as your tiny little medieval fantasy town of Rhinoka is visited from, and I shit you not, a galactic trade federation that only barely doesn't arrest you all for stealing from the dungeons the whole game, because you killed the interdimensional space pirates that started the whole thing. Like, what the fuck? Where did this come from? Why don't I fight more space pirates outside of because the rest died, which is honestly a pretty shit reason. They would have been interesting. Forget more combat mechanics. Digital Sun Games had a sweet opportunity for randomized villain encounters that could have popped up the whole game long, and they didn't do it. Space pirates? Not till the end. We needed some way to wrap up and explain why magical dungeons with infinite loot popped up out of nowhere. For me, where the dungeons came from mattered only to Will. I'm not sure if I needed back-ended space pirates that killed each other off while they were trapped in a hidden pocket dimension to explain the roguelike mechanics from a lore perspective. So, Moonlighter doesn't have the most interesting combat, and its story is mediocre at best. Still, I can't help but like the game. Its addicting feedback gameplay loop of delve, sell, improve is very fun to work through most of the time, but very importantly, the game is comfortable. It's like a warm blanket on a cold morning, something soft and yet quite pleasant, despite maybe being a bit scratchy. The combat is simple, and the top-down old-school look and feel of it makes it easy to understand and become proficient with. The story is basic, so you don't have to think about it much. The shopkeeping is surprisingly interesting and mechanically active enough that you really don't have time to get bored and lean on the counter. It's this relaxed and kinder-natured style of game that keeps Moonlighter in my mind. Compared to so many other games that use similar mechanics, Moonlighter opts to keep things idyllic and rustic, with enough visual polish that the mechanical and narrative missteps of the game are easier to waive in favor of just letting go. Taking it easy, relaxing, kicking up your feet and taking a stroll down Golem Lane. Pick up some new stuff on the way, if you want. Rest a while in a hot spring. When you're done, go back to town. Do some shopping, watch your numbers go up, and then rinse and repeat. I'd say it's mindless, but it's almost mindfulness with how meditative it can be. Moonlighter will not gain the reputation of The Legend of Zelda, nor the mechanically satisfying gameplay from Dead Cells. It won't be telling grand and interesting stories you might find in dedicated RPGs, nor will it have you humming its tunes all day like Shovel Knight. But Moonlighter will be charming. It will be kind, it will be positive, and it will be encouraging. It's a pick-me-up game, where after a rough day you just need something to sweeten the bitter edges that life sometimes throws at you. If you're looking for something comfortable and relatively simple to occupy your time, or to teach someone how to play games like Moonlighter, Moonlighter does a good thing for you. It'll work day or night, whenever you want, to give what it is that it has to offer. Like a good store might, fittingly enough. Thanks for watching. At long last, I finished the review for Moonlighter. It's the first I've done in a while, but I'm hoping to have a lot more of these posted in the new year. I meant to have this done much earlier, like months earlier, but I kept wasting the gratuitous amounts of time I had. Despite this, the following people on Patreon had enough faith in me to support this endeavor. People like Torval, Stephen Millette, Burgles, and Eldadrez. They've been backing me since September, so they've been waiting quite a while for this one, and I'd like to go ahead and offer a special thanks to Torval in particular for his donations over on Patreon. If you'd like to go ahead and do the same thing, be my guest and visit the Patreon. You can find the description. You can find the link in the description below. But it's by no means necessary, and I'll be continuing to post these things for you folks to watch and listen to if you like these. If all goes well, I'd also like to write more on other games, like Hollow Knight, which is probably my next one. It's my favorite game of all time now, and there's a lot to say. I hopefully will have it done by February if all goes well. Celeste is also on the docket thanks to its interesting meld of music, motion, and mechanics. It really is something else. I keep bringing it up with other people that have no idea what I'm talking about, so it would be nice to speak about it with you folks. Anyway, thanks for watching one more time, and I'll see you folks in the next one.